Good afternoon, everybody. There is nothing new in sexual abuse of minors. It's been going on forever, and sadly, it will continue. Nearly always, it's perpetrated by somebody who is very, very close or a trusted figure to the person being abused. It works because of secrecy and fear. The abused individual is told, if you say anything about this, I'll either hurt you or your parents, or do something awful to you. But the difference with what we call the grooming gang scandal is that it is the mass industrial scale sexual assault and rape by anonymous, unknown persons, and it's been going on across this country on a scale that is simply...
Imagine being Prime Minister whilst people are literally dying in the streets fighting for the very freedoms you take for granted, and your response is deafening silence. Not cautious diplomacy, not carefully worded statement balancing competing interests, but actual silence. Nothing. Nada. Complete radio silence whilst brave Iranians face down one of the world's most brutal regimes, risking everything for basic human rights. That's the accusation Dame Priti Patel has just leveled at Sir Keir Starmer, and honestly, it's absolutely devastating. The shadow foreign secretary has taken aim at the Prime Minister for sitting in silence over deadly protests in Iran, which have left at least 16 dead over the past week, and she's not holding back. This isn't just political point scoring. This is fundamental question about whether Britain still stands anything beyond its own narrow interests, whether we still speak up for human rights and democracy, or whether we become so timid, so cautious, so afraid of offending authoritarian regimes that we've lost our moral voice entirely. Let's unpack this absolutely explosive criticism. Quick favor. If you're loving what we're doing here at British Mirror, hit that subscribe button and smash the bell icon. Over 94% of you haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free, takes about 2 seconds, and honestly means a world to us. Cheers if you've already done it. Right, back to the show. The shadow foreign secretary has taken aim at Sir Keir Starmer for sitting in silence over deadly protests in Iran, which have left at least 16 dead over the past week. 16 dead. That's 16 people who woke up hoping for freedom, who took to the streets despite knowing the risks, who faced down security forces willing to use lethal force, and who paid the ultimate price. 16 families mourning loved ones who died fighting tyranny. And Britain's Prime Minister, leader of a nation that historically championed liberty and stood against oppression, has apparently said nothing, sitting in silence. That's not neutrality. That's complicity through inaction. That's watching injustice unfold and choosing not to speak. The Islamic Republic is currently embattled with its biggest demonstration since 2022 after the nation's currency took a hit and citizens started to voice their disdain for the regime. Biggest demonstration since 2022. That's significant because the 2022 protests were massive, sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini after her arrest by morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. Those protests shook the regime, demonstrated widespread public discontent, and were brutally suppressed with hundreds killed. If current protests match or exceed that scale, we're witnessing a genuinely historic moment in Iran's struggle for freedom. The nation's currency took a hit. Economic collapse often triggers political upheaval because it makes daily life unbearable, strips away what little stability people had, and demonstrates regime's fundamental failure to provide for citizens. However, critics of Sir Keir have pointed out the Prime Minister has remained quiet on the matter. Remain quiet. That's diplomatic language for shameful cowardice. When people are dying for freedom, silence from democratic leaders isn't neutrality. It's betrayal. It sends message to brave protesters that the West doesn't care, that their sacrifice doesn't matter, that they are alone against the regime. And it sends message to the regime that they can kill with impunity because nobody important is watching or willing to impose consequences. Speaking on the Camilla Tominey show, Dame Priti raged with passion that crackles through the transcript. They are dying for their freedom, and that might be a difficult concept for us to comprehend. They are fighting and dying for their freedom. Dying for their freedom. That's not abstract political struggle. That's people literally sacrificing their lives for the rights we take completely for granted. The right to speak freely, to choose our leaders, to live without fear of arbitrary arrest, to dress how we please, to love who we choose. Things so basic, so fundamental, We barely think about them, and Iranians are dying to achieve them whilst Britain's Prime Minister says nothing. Look at the tyrannical regime with the Ayatollahs in Tehran. Tyrannical regime. That's not diplomatic hedging. That's calling Iran what it is: authoritarian theocracy that brutally suppresses dissent, executes political prisoners, oppresses women, funds terrorism across the Middle East, and poses existential threat to regional stability. It is extraordinary with the level of protests that we've seen. We haven't seen protests of this nature, I think, since 2022, when we saw the most appalling brutality against women in particular for not fully covering their hair. Most appalling brutality against women for not fully covering their hair. That's Iran's morality police, religious enforcers who beat, arrest, and sometimes kill women for violating dress codes. That's the regime Turkey is apparently too timid to criticize. This is a really big moment. Actually, it could be a crossroads. It could be a turning point. That's Priti Patel recognizing the potential historical significance. When regimes face this level of sustained protest, outcomes are genuinely uncertain. Sometimes protests succeed and regimes fall, like in Eastern Europe in 1989 or Arab Spring in 2011. Sometimes they are brutally suppressed and regimes survive, like Tiananmen Square or Syria. But these moments of potential transformation require international support. When protesters know the world is watching, when they hear democratic leaders championing their cause, it gives them strength, hope, legitimacy. When they hear nothing, it's demoralizing and dangerous. She added with devastating critique, they are a threat to our national security. So how can we have a prime minister in a Labour government that sits in silence and sits on their hands? Threat to our national security. That's crucial point often missed in human rights debates. Supporting Iranian protesters isn't just moral obligation, it's strategic necessity. Iran funds Hezbollah, backs Assad in Syria, supports Houthi rebels in Yemen, provides drones to Russia for use against Ukraine, and pursues nuclear weapons despite international opposition. A freer, more democratic Iran would be dramatically less threatening to British interests. Supporting protests isn't altruism. It's enlightened self-interest. Sits on their hands. That's image of passivity, a deliberate inaction, of watching injustice and choosing not to intervene even verbally. At this particular moment, I just don't think that's acceptable. Not acceptable. That's measured language conveying genuine moral outrage. Priti Patel, who served as Home Secretary and seen intelligence briefings about Iranian threats, understands both the moral imperative and strategic necessity of supporting Iranian protesters. And she's appalled that Turkey apparently doesn't or won't act on that understanding. A staggering 68% of those surveyed by YouGov between December 27th and 29th said they disapproved of Turkey's government. 68%. More than two-thirds of the country actively disapproves. Just 12% said they approved. 12%. That's not just unpopular. That's historically, catastrophically, career-endingly unpopular. Another poll in November showed half of Labour voters want Turkey to quit. Half of his own voters. Not opponents, not swing voters, but people who actually voted Labour in July 2024 now think he should resign. When your own supporters have turned against you, you've got a problem that can't be fixed with better messaging or policy tweaks. You've got a fundamental crisis of confidence. Sir Keir's future at number 10 is likely to be decided on May 7th when elections will be held for the Welsh Senate, Scottish Parliament, and local authorities in England. May 7th. That's the real deadline. Not 2027, not the next general election, but May 7th, 2026. If Labour gets hammered in those elections, and all evidence suggests they will, the pressure on Sir Keir will become unbearable. Backbench MPs facing decimation in their constituencies will start demanding change. Party donors will panic. The media will declare his premiership finished. He might survive, but he'll be mortally wounded, a zombie prime minister limping towards inevitable defeat. Labour currently leads the Senate, but is expected to get a drubbing at the polls in what would mark an historic defeat for Welsh Labour, which has been in power since devolution began in 1999. Since devolution began, Labour has controlled Wales for a quarter century. If they lose that stronghold, it's not just politically embarrassing. It's symbolically devastating. It would signal that even in Labour's traditional heartlands, even in areas that have voted Labour for generations, the party is being rejected. That's not a temporary blip. That's a fundamental realignment. While Sir Keir and his cronies are emphasizing stability and talk of efforts to ease the cost of living, others are waiting in the wings to take the helm. Waiting in the wings. That's diplomatic language for sharpening their knives. Health Secretary Wes Streeting, Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood, and Mayor of Greater Manchester Andy Burnham have all been reported as harboring leadership ambitions. Harboring leadership ambitions. That's a delicate way of saying they're positioning themselves to replace Sir Keir when, not if, he falls. These aren't idle rumors. These are serious politicians with significant support bases calculating when to make their move. Wes Streeting is particularly interesting because he's been remarkably visible and outspoken for a health secretary. His take on the NHS, the unions, and vested interests with a boldness that contrasts sharply with Sir Keir's caution. Whether you agree with his positions or not, he's demonstrating political courage and clarity that makes him an obvious alternative if Labour decides they need a change. Shabana Mahmood as Home Secretary is handling some of the most contentious issues around immigration and law and order, giving her visibility and authority. Andy Burnham, meanwhile, has cultivated an image as a successful regional leader who actually delivers for his constituents, offering a contrast to Westminster dysfunction. The fact these names are being openly discussed as potential replacements, while Sir Keir insists he'll still be Prime Minister next year, tells you everything about how weak his position actually is. Strong leaders don't face constant speculation about their successors. Secure prime ministers don't have to repeatedly insist they'll still be in post 12 months hence. The very fact that Keir is making these statements reveals how precarious his situation has become. He's not projecting strength. He's desperately trying to stave off a leadership challenge he knows is coming. What makes Sir Keir's position particularly tragic is that he won such a massive majority, 411 seats. A parliamentary landslide, the kind of majority most politicians dream about, the kind of majority that should give you freedom to implement your vision, to take bold action, to transform the country. Instead, Sir Keir has squandered that majority through timidity, poor communication, and policies that alienate both his progressive base and the working-class voters Labour needs to retain. He has managed the extraordinary feat of uniting both wings of his coalition in disappointment and frustration. The comparison to the conservative chaos of 2022 and 2023 is instructive, but not in the way Sir Keir thinks. Yes, the constant leadership changes were damaging. Yes, the instability hurt the country. But at least the Conservatives recognized when leaders had failed and removed them. Liz Truss lasted 4 to 9 days because her policies crashed the economy and her party removed her. That's accountability. What Sir Keir is arguing for is that Labour should stick with him regardless of performance, regardless of polling, regardless of electoral consequences, because changing leaders would be chaotic. That's not stability. That's stubbornness. That's prioritizing his own position over the party's electoral prospects.